Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Bonnie Friedman, co-president of Sisterhood. And I'm excited to introduce Seth Stern, who is going to give us a great presentation all about speaking Yiddish to chicken. And without any further ado, Seth, take us away because I am definitely curious about this. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Jill for the invitation to speak with you today, and to Ira for making sure that you can see and hear me. I know Jill listened to a recent talk I gave for the Mill program at Malloy College, and she mentioned at least one member of your congregation has ties to New Jersey's Jewish farming past. For the rest of you, I'll be showing some photos as I talk to give you a sense of the time and place that I'm talking about. I'm going to start by going back 25 years, and while home there on Long Island, I grew up nearby in Hewlett. I was studying for law school finals in December 1998, and I visited my grandmother each afternoon at her apartment in Cedarhurst and started asking her about her life over lunch. We talked about growing up in Lublin, Poland, how she and my grandfather survived the war hiding in an underground forest dugout where they survived as partisans, and then coming to the US as refugees. You can see my grandparents here in this photo. My mom is the dark-haired baby in the center. They're on the Marine Perch, the former U.S. troop transport ship that brought them to the U.S. in February of 1947. In the years after those initial conversations with my grandmother, I visited Lublin and Belzec, the extermination camp where my grandparents' families were killed, and Bensheim, the town in Germany where they lived as displaced persons. But the part of their story that came to fascinate me the most is how my grandparents and roughly 1,000 other survivors came to settle as poultry farmers in South Jersey. This is a personal story for me, and I explore in the book how my family and my grandmother's best childhood friend came to share a single farmhouse for many years and raise their daughters as twins. This is the photo that's on the cover of the book. That's my mom on the right with the dark hair. My grandmother is right above her, and that the other girl and mom are my grandmother's best childhood friends, and they were on the same farm for about 4 years, 5 years. But this book is also a broader story about how Jews came to be farmers in the United States and why survivors wound up in this unique South Jersey community halfway between Atlantic City and Philadelphia. Most Jewish immigrants in this country gravitated to big cities, but smaller numbers settled in rural America, whether that was Appalachia coal country or California gold rush or the Mississippi Delta, where in each of these communities they tended to start out as peddlers selling whatever they could carry on their backs or a horse or a mule, and then ultimately open dry goods stores. A few had tried farming, often with the help of the Jewish Agricultural Society, which was founded by a philanthropist named Baron Morris de Hirsch. The first big wave of Jewish agriculture came in the 1880s when idealistic Russian Jews established communal farming colonies throughout the US. Most of these colonies quickly failed, whether due to bad weather, the farmers' inexperience, malaria, bad luck. The few that survived tended to be in South Jersey, where they were close to big markets in New York and Philadelphia. By the early 20th century, the Jewish Agricultural Society had largely given up on colonies and focused instead on settling Jewish families on individual farms. The Jewish Agricultural Society started publishing The Jewish Farmer, which is pictured here, the first and only of its kind agricultural magazine that was published in both English and Yiddish. This is the last issue from the late 1950s. You could see the front of it was in English, and then if you flipped it over, you could read in Yiddish. And it was designed to help these family farmers who may not have known much about farming and given them tips and news about farming. So by the 1930s, Jews were farming in all 48 then existing states, but they were mostly concentrated in the Northeast, from the Berkshires in Massachusetts into Connecticut, the Catskills area in New York, and then down into central New Jersey communities such as Lakewood and Farmingdale and Toms River. The form of farming that tended to work out the best was chicken farming. It required less capital, it was less physically demanding, excuse me, and it required less land. So when the first Jewish refugees to make it out of Germany arrived during the Great Depression in the late 1930s, the Jewish Agricultural Society saw poultry farming as a great solution and looked to South Jersey as an ideal place to direct them, since farms tended to be cheaper there. There was an influx of refugee farmers in and around Vineland, this community of 30,000 people. You can see two of these refugee Jewish farming families here, including the photo on the right the Sun likes to describe as their version of American Gothic. As this photo of Vineland's Main Street, Landis Avenue from that era shows, they moved to a community that looked like many small towns. There was a Woolworth's Five and Dime, a Sears department store, a Pontiac dealership, but it was also uniquely laid out with glass and clothing factories mingling with farms and many Jewish-owned businesses. The descendants of the original Italian immigrants tended to grow fruits and vegetables, and Jewish farmers raised chickens. These displaced persons, as they were known, who had lost so much during the war and came to the US without much money and knew little English, were attracted to farming by the promise of being their own boss, and as the book title suggests, the fact that the chickens didn't care if you spoke Yiddish to them. Survivors dissatisfied with life in New York or whichever big city they'd initially landed in usually heard about poultry farming by word of mouth, whether it was a distant relative or a landsman from their hometown or someone they met in a displaced persons camp after the war. Many newcomers who'd never farmed before and had little idea of what it involved expected farming would be easy. You don't do nothing, just collect the money, one survivor remembered hearing in Detroit before moving to Vineland, as if chickens laid $10 bills instead of eggs. As I'll discuss, the reality of farm life was much different. At first, timing worked out in their favor. These new arrivals who suffered so much during the war benefited from the start of the Korean War, which drove up demand for eggs, and egg prices reached all-time highs in 1951. In this era, poultry was king in Vineland. The high school dubbed its football team the Poultry Clan. This was their emblem. The city had billboards boasting of it being the home of Vineland eggs, and Vineland even hosted a poultry festival that boasted the world's largest frying pan. There were hundreds of local poultry farms, including 500 purchased by Holocaust survivors alone. There were 17 feed mills and 25 hatcheries and poultry dealers operating in the area. Many of these businesses were Jewish-owned, such as the Rubinoff feed mill pictured here, which was the largest of its kind in the eastern United States. The Vineland Egg Auction was shipping 600,000 cases of eggs. That's 18 million eggs to New York City in the mid-50s. And it wasn't just Vineland and South Jersey. Poultry was the top agricultural enterprise in the state, and there were 4 counties in New Jersey that were among the top 10 for chicken population. To give you some sense of what the farms were like, at the time, the typical family farm in the Vineland area was roughly 10 acres and housed 3,000 to 4,000 chickens. Most were raising chickens for the eggs, while a few sold them for meat, which were known as broilers. Even in the best of times, this was dirty, difficult work. You had to wake up early in the morning to make sure the chickens' water hadn't frozen. You couldn't easily take a day off because the chickens needed to be fed 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Viruses could wipe out whole flocks. Wild dogs would snatch chickens in the middle of the night. Hens were nasty when cooped up together and could peck each other to death or smother each other in a panic during air raid drills, which were frequent during the Cold War. The stench of their waste was overpowering. Brooder stoves used to keep baby chicks warm could catch fire and burn down the coops. Finding reliable laborers was challenging, and most of the newcomers who arrived during this period, particularly the refugees, had never farmed before and had no idea what they were doing at the start. Many had grown up in big cities and found it isolating to live on farms. They're embarrassing, others who moved to farms from crowded New York apartments found comfort in having so much land to themselves, even if they had to share it with a few thousand hens. The newcomers' embarrassing missteps became the butt of jokes among veteran poultry farmers and local veterinarians, like the farmer who washed his eggs with water so warm they hard-boiled inside, or the farmer who, told to give his chickens a teaspoon of vaccine, substituted an old family heirloom spoon 3 times too big and poisoned his whole flock. These are the kind of mistakes you only made once. Many newcomers who had hoped for a stable, quiet life recoiled at the uncertainty. Some dropped out of the poultry business as soon as they arrived. One survivor refugee lasted only 9 weeks raising chickens before he found a job making draperies and slipcovers at the Sears department store. But many more of these new farmers stuck it out. As one farm wife later recalled, "You'd be surprised how fast you can learn if you're in a jam. We had to make a living and take care of the children, and you just did it. We were fast learners. We had to be." Part of what eased the transition was the uniquely large Jewish presence in Vineland. I'd mentioned earlier how Jews had always settled in rural America, but by the 1950s, most rural Jewish communities had begun to shrink as Jews, like everyone else in rural America, had moved on to cities and onto the suburbs. In Vineland, the descendants of the original farm colony settlers and the German refugees that followed had built a remarkably robust Jewish community full of synagogues, kosher bakeries, butcher shops, and delis. Decades later, so many people I spoke with recalled the taste of Goldstein's pastrami and the smell of onion rolls from one of the Jewish-owned bakeries half a block away. Vineland had multiple Zionist organizations and a half-hour local radio show every Sunday morning called The Voice of Israel. In the 1950s, Manischewitz opened a plant there to make borscht and gefilte fish. This was an ad that appeared in Jewish newspapers throughout the country in the mid-1950s, boasting that the Manischewitz gefilte fish was made with the famous Vineland, New Jersey eggs. The eggs were famous, but the survivors who were producing them, their story was little known beyond South Jersey. The survivors would enrich this Jewish community and make it their own. They built shtiebels, or small shuls, often with their own hands, within walking distance of their farms. This is the one with the Hebrew name for the surviving remnant that was on the same block as my grandparents' farm. This is a favorite picture of mine when congregants celebrated the arrival of their Torah outside the shtibel, my grandfather's holding the staff in front. They created the Jewish Poultry Farmers Association, a Landsmannschaft, or combination mutual aid society and social club, like the ones earlier generations of immigrants established in big cities. Their Farband, Yiddish for association as they called it, hosted dinner dances and stars of the Yiddish stage. These comedians, poets, and journalists, many of whom themselves were displaced persons, would travel around the country or North and South America to wherever survivors had settled. And in Vineland, they performed to standing room only crowds at the local high school and junior high, the only venues capable of holding hundreds of people. The survivors, they also commemorated what would later become known as the Holocaust. This is a flyer for the event in 1961. It was usually held in April to coincide with the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The survivors kept to themselves at first. They later remembered feeling unwelcome by the existing Jewish community. Some recalled American-born Jews could be downright cruel, with comments about how they must have done something wrong to end up in a prison camp. It's difficult so many decades later to tease out exactly what explains the community dynamics. What survivors experienced as cruelty might have been fumbling attempts by American-born Jews unsure about what to say, unintentionally saying the wrong thing. Even the most well-meaning American Jews found it difficult to relate to survivors face to face. They had no conception of what survivors had endured or how to talk to them. Some survivors may have avoided American-born Jews because they felt self-conscious around them, although the earlier German Jewish refugees had recalled feeling equally unwelcome when they arrived. The German Jews and post-war survivors also largely stayed apart at first, with both feeling more comfortable among their own. They preferred to pray in their own language and socialize in their own language. These distinctions tended to break down over time, with the children of survivors and German Jewish refugees joking about intermarriage with the American-born Jews decades later. Many of the survivor farmers had very warm memories of their time there, while others hated every minute, which was in many cases such a drastic fall in status from their lives in Europe. Their children tended to enjoy farm life, which could be both idyllic and dangerous. My mother's earliest memories included petting soft baby chicks. There was a brief period of time when the chicks were cute and cuddly before they became nasty and vicious. This photo still sits on my mom's shelf at home. She also recalled the sight of the rifle her father kept handy to kill predators trying to snatch chickens. They had ample opportunity to explore their physical surroundings and were granted a great deal of freedom to do so. The labor-intensive work of running a farm meant their parents didn't have the time to watch over their children closely throughout the day. The children had to entertain themselves, particularly during summer breaks. Nearly everyone recalled days on a patch of sand along the Morris River where the children played, teenagers danced at the jukebox, and their parents played cards while gossiping in Yiddish. On the one hand, the survivors' children lived a very cloistered life, full of Jewish Poultry Farmers Association, Hanukkah, Purim, and as in this photo, Lag BaOmer parties and socializing with other farm families in Yiddish or Polish or Hungarian. But the Grinna as they were known, a play on the term greenhorn for newcomer, also felt pressure to keep up with neighbors and provide whatever they imagined a proper American childhood required. So they made sure to sign their kids up for Little League or Girl and Boy Scouts. This is my mother's troop posing with Vineland's mayor on the occasion of his birthday. At times, they could feel uncomfortable cast in their small schoolhouse Christmas pageants. Some families avoided this dissonance by enrolling their children in the private Jewish day school that opened in the fall of 1953 in a renovated farmhouse. Only in Vineland at this moment in time could the eventual site of the Jewish day school share the same stretch of rural road as Jewish chicken farms, a shtibel, as well as the grounds of a rodeo horse show and a nearby car racing track. The families who would walk home from the shtibel, which was built near the farm so they could walk to Shabbat. If they were walking home on Friday night, they could hear the cars racing in the background. As teenagers, the survivors' children watched Dick Clark's American Bandstand to pick up on the latest fashions, hairdos, and dance moves, while their mothers felt guilty if they couldn't afford to throw them a proper Sweet 16. As teenagers, the survivors' children, the Jewish Agricultural Society and the survivors didn't know it at the time, but these refugees had entered poultry farming at the worst possible moment. Small family farms were finding it increasingly difficult to compete with mega farms in the South that had much lower labor costs and could support 50,000, 100,000, and ultimately 1,000,000 chickens. In October 1954, Hurricane Hazel barreled through Vineland, peeling the roofs off of coops like the lids of tin cans and killing or leaving homeless tens of thousands of birds. Given the hard times ahead, the lucky ones might actually have been the farmers who lost everything and used insurance proceeds to start over in a new business or in an entirely different place. Farm families looked for other ways to supplement their income as egg prices dropped. Many farm wives, including my grandmother, found work at Vineland garment factories. Others tried branching out into adjacent businesses such as cracking eggs for bakeries or processing kosher chickens. Others would abandon farming altogether. As the 60s progressed, they found it increasingly hard to make a living, and many began abandoning their farms or South Jersey for better work elsewhere. They couldn't, in many instances, sell their farms because no one wanted to buy them, and the only option was bankruptcy or just abandoning them in the middle of the night. My grandparents and mother stayed until she graduated high school in 1964. In the decade that followed, nearly every farm ceased operating, and the Jewish community began to shrink as similar rural Jewish communities had already contracted almost everywhere else in rural America. By the time I first visited Vineland in 2004 on my first research trip there, few relics remained from the city's poultry past. This is the farm across the road from where my mom grew up. You could see the coops here have been abandoned and they were eventually torn down. In writing this book, I hope I've helped preserve this mostly forgotten chapter in Jewish American history and given some sense of what this unique place was like in this era. I also had more selfish motive in dedicating a good chunk of the last quarter century to this project. If nothing else, I hope my college-age niece and nephew, who got to know my grandmother before she died in 2014, will read the book. And one day, I hope my son, who's now 8 years old and was born a year after she died, will also learn the story and perhaps share it with his children one day. There was an exhibit at the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia on New Jersey's Jewish farming history. They had a temporary exhibit there when he was about a year old, so I took him there so he could play with the stuffed chicken. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you again for being here. I hope you've enjoyed listening. I'm happy to take questions, and if you want to look at the photos I shared here and other ones, I have a Facebook book page, facebook.com/Yiddish to chicken. So thank you again, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Seth.
Yes, Jones Sydney. I had a cousin who went to Vineland, New Jersey. They were born in Brooklyn. They were born in Brooklyn. I'm sorry. And he took my cousin, who was a Brooklyn girl. His name was Nat Shapiro, but he called himself Nate Shapiro. And I don't know how long they stayed there, but I do remember them having a chicken and egg farm, which I thought was very unusual for a Brooklyn girl to go up and do something like that. So
yeah, not
other history.
Not every farm family there were survivors. There were
no, they weren't. No.
Yeah,
no, he wasn't.
So there were some of them were veterans. They might have come back from the war and they wanted to settle somewhere else or do something different. Certainly during the Depression, when jobs were scarce, people saw farms as a good alternative. So that explains some of the influx in the 30s. So while most of the new farmers after 1945 were survivors, not all of them were. So.
Great. Anybody have any questions for Seth? And also we have Ruth here with us. So anybody has questions for Ruth, please jump in. Ruth is going to come up right now. Ruth is Seth's mom, Ruth Stern.
Hi, Seth.
Hello.
I wanted to add one very important aspect of our life on the farm was recreating the family atmosphere because we all lost everything. There were very few people, our parents including came from large families and they were the only ones who survived. And they were married as Parkinson's and hid in the woods. So it became a very tight, close-knit family. And I personally did not feel so different because all the people around me were survivors. Although what Seth alluded to is very true. We were not welcomed very warmly by the outside community. They viewed us as greenhorns. Perhaps we were the reminders of the worst possible thing that happened to Jews. So they were slightly off by us. But from what I can recall, it was a good life. It was a good life, although there were many, many hardships. My parents really came there with nothing. And we took my mother back when she was 80. She wanted to see what was left behind. And we went to the first farm we shared with another family. And she pointed to this huge patch of land and she said, that's where I grew all our food. So it was interesting because I always wondered. They were urban people. They lived in Vineland, Poland. That's where I was born. I was born actually in Lodz, on the way to Duke. But it was very difficult to come from that environment, to survive the Holocaust, and settle on the farm. So my mother's lesson to me was always, you do what you have to do to survive. And what she said to me was that the patch of land she had shown me was where they grew all the food that we ate. And in addition to an abundance of chicken and eggs, we had a lot of vegetables, all kinds of potatoes, whatever. And there were other people who brought her out and kind of going help each other in this room. Very good questions. Farm life, lesson. I can't remember.
What I get up, speak into the microphone.
I can't hear it. Could you repeat the question?
The DP camp, was it Benzone?
Bensheim, yeah,
Benzone.
near Frankfurt.
In Germany, Frankfurt. Benzone.
Could you pick up the face in the mic?
The camps for my family was known to have gone with Belsen. That was the one near Vineland, but some went on Auschwitz.
So your parents were in a concentration?
My parents were very unusual in that they were married and they fled together. They were not in a concentration camp. Did anyone see the movie, was it Diversion? At the Belzak brothers? Yes. Well, it was about partisans, and that's who my father was. He was a partisan. He had a gun. My mother lived they lived in several bunkers underground. If they heard the Nazis were coming, they had to flee and live in another bunker. But no, they were not in camps. That doesn't mean their life was easy though. I remember having a very close friend on the farm who lived about a quarter-mile away. And my experience, and many survivors' children's experience, was either their parents didn't stop talking about their experiences, or they did not discuss their experiences. My parents did not discuss their experiences. My mother was much more comfortable sharing her life with Seth than she was with me. But I would have a sleepover every weekend with my friend Helen, and her mother was in Bergen-Belsen. And although she made delicious breakfasts and I loved my friend, I would have to listen to stories about how the Nazis would put their fingernails off for choosing the concentration camp and all kinds of other gruesome stories. So Helen moved to California so she couldn't, because she couldn't take the stories in. Anybody else? I was on the farm. I was on the farm until I finished high school. My parents would have left many years earlier, except for my care.
Did you ask them?
Oh, I was an only child. Which was unusual. Most of the survivors have been children. My mother had lost other children. Was an experience.
I just wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about, because Seth, you had referenced sort of the shift in Americanization and when the kids were, you know, that you had these traditional European Jewish families in that generation, but do you remember sort of consciously, like even the Girl Scouts and Brownies, but sort of like the shift to dressing maybe more American, or speaking, or eating, or just any cultural things that sort of started the shift from being more traditional European from your parents' generation to.
So that'll be our next book, because I could write a book. Write a book about that. There's so much, my parents wanted, well, the Holocaust, it's interesting, the word Holocaust, Seth alluded to that. I always heard about the war in the Republic. The word Holocaust, I think, came to, I'm not gonna say vogue, but to be known in the 60s. I never heard of the word Holocaust. But the parents, such as mine, wanted the children to become assimilated. They wanted the children to have the American experience. They gave us as much as they could, given the limited financial status, brownies, gymnastics, ballet, whatever they heard the American children were doing, they tried to expose us to. What was it again?
Like, you remember, even just like,
Oh, I went to school, perfect. I went to school with my friend who I lived with. Not speaking English. My languages were Yiddish and Polish, which I still speak. And, English as a second language was not taught back. So it was very difficult. And I learned how to speak English from watching How to Do This. And whatever other shows that were on television, I mean, it's black and white television, it was so exciting, and I heard English, and I guess kids pick up languages very quickly. That's how I learned. But as far as being assimilated, yeah, like Seth said, we watched Bandstand, we had, you know, the typical teenage parties, people on the main street, all that.
So you don't consider yourself, your family would be survivors, even though you survived the war, you survived the Germans coming. Oh, the fact that they weren't in concentration camps, but they were in bunkers, hiding away. You see that as a differentiation?
I don't see that as a differentiation at all. I can tell you horror stories about what they went through being underground. On having to eat whatever animal was out there, starving, having to shoot some non-Jews in order to get food. I mean, they went through hell. There were people who were shot. There were people, my parents stayed in the bunkers who were killed. Definitely, they're not in any different category. I consider myself a survivor. I volunteer at the Stephenhurst JCC. They have a survivor group, and these survivors were children. Because my mother would have been about when we could find that she lived. And I love going there because I speak Yiddish and Polish. Very few people do today. So there's no differentiation.
I think Holocaust has come to represent 6 million Jews that died. I mean, that's, you know, just a genuine word. I don't think it differentiates among the people who had the experience.
Oh, how they survived, absolutely not. Anyone who survived the Great War. That's why they're survivors. They went through the horror stories. And what, especially given the losses.
In terms of the book, I don't differentiate between, I mean, there were really only a few ways to survive. You survived a camp, whether it was an extermination, which was much rarer, or a labor camp. You survived as a partisan fighting in the forests. You survived by passing as a non-Jew in a city or in hiding with a non-Jewish family, or you survived by being in the Soviet Union, by fleeing and then being in some form of captivity or labor in Siberia, and then in the republics of the southern USSR. That was pretty much it. But at all of those categories, you were a survivor. I think the image of survivor as someone who survived the camps is what, because of the horrors of it, is most imprinted in everyone's mind. But all of them survived. They, in almost all cases, lost everyone and everything they had from before the war, no matter how they survived the war.
I give you an example of one aspect of life. My mother, was in a bunker with 2 or 3 other families. And my mother delivered a baby, friend's child. And they had to leave the baby behind because they heard the Nazis were coming. And what happened was they covered her in leaves, and by some miracle, they went back 3 days later and she was still there alive. There were many people, including one of the families members, who stayed with, gave birth, and they found as righteous Gentiles and many Polish people. Not everyone was evil. They found people who would take their babies, and they would keep them for 2 or 3 years until the Holocaust was over. And then when these parents went back to claim their children, they didn't want to go with them. And that was not an unusual situation. It's very sad.
I mean, I was just thinking this, and now that you said this, I just recently read a book that's popular fiction about 5 different examples of children whose parents had hidden them in some way. Most of them were in Catholic orphanages, and the church was extremely active in wanting to keep those children and baptized. And then when the Polish organization was trying to reclaim them, they actually had to go to court. And the children were actually stolen from the Polish families, brought to Israel in order to keep them as Jewish children. But they lived conflicted lives as adults because they didn't remember their parents. They had the Catholic upbringing. They go past the church. I mean, it was a very, very troubled, their journey to adulthood. And being in Israel did not instantly make them feel Jewish, I mean, that they belonged. So I mean, I had never really thought about that. Yes. You always think that the children were reunited with their parents survived. And most of the times we think about that the parents didn't survive. And in some of these cases, the parents didn't survive, but their families did. And they were trying to seek their nephews, nieces, cousins.
And you know what you're saying also, and brings to mind, I don't recall that in all rights that he passed, but there were many people who did not know they were Jewish. And that was very common. Because of where they wound up, who they were given to, and once they started doing independent research, they made more of that.
Hi, Seth, it's Jill.
Hi.
I have questions for you.
Sure.
One, and Ruth kind of alluded to it. What does Vineland and that area look like now? Is it still farmland, and sort of when did it change? Answer that, and then I gotta go.
Yeah, I mean, Vineland, that area, South Jersey, there's still some agriculture there, more fruits and vegetables than chickens, but the poultry industry has largely shriveled away. As I mentioned, the competition from the South, the poultry industry just migrated away from South Jersey because it was cheaper to produce chickens and eggs elsewhere. It's sort of a depressed area. It's can be essentially a suburb of Philadelphia, but all of the local industry, there used to be glass making, food processing, that's all disappeared, or largely. Like I mentioned, the Manischewitz plant closed, and that's been that's gone. There's a little bit of the garment industry left. They're still making uniforms for the U.S. military because the procurement rules require that to be made domestically, so it's not subject to the same kind of foreign competition. And so the Crown Clothing Factory, where my grandmother worked, is still there. And when I went there, going on 10 years ago, they were still making U.S. military uniforms. But in general, it's a more of an economically depressed area. The Jewish population has shrunk, and it's become much more Latino. At first, Puerto Rican migrants, people from Puerto Rico, moved there to be farm laborers. And that was the beginning of a big boom, so that 30–40% of the local population is now Latino, far exceeding what the Jewish population once was.
Great, and the other one, goes more to your childhood and growing up, because your grandmother, what you were saying, her relationship with Seth about that. So did you have, as far as your friends, did you have a lot of friends who had European grandparents who were present in part of your life, or were you more in like totally American kind of community? I'm just wondering.
I mean, I grew up in Hewlett, which I don't think is representative of America. It was so overwhelmingly Jewish and Italian. I joked, I don't think I met a Protestant until I went to college. So it wasn't exactly your sample of the United States. I mean, I think I had other friends who had survivor relatives. I mean, a lot of it was just my grandmother's whole social circle, and my mom's to some extent too. There were many survivors. I remember my grandparents would go to a bungalow colony in the Catskills, and I was struck at the age of 8 by all of the people who had tattoos on their arms who were Auschwitz survivors. So, I mean, it was part of my life exposure to survivors, even although I couldn't say like in high school what proportion of my classmates who were overwhelmingly Jewish, how many of them might have had survivor grandparents.
Anybody on Zoom like to ask any questions? Anybody here, any other questions?
I have a question. I missed when these survivors were went to the farms for the chicken farms. How did they pay for it? Were they given the land?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way it worked is, no, they weren't given it outright as some sort of gift. They had to take out mortgages, and then the Jewish Agricultural Society would take out a second mortgage, sort of being a guarantor, helping them. But it was a loan, and as time went by and as egg prices fell, many of these farmers could no longer pay the mortgage. So you had tremendous amount of defaults. People couldn't pay the mortgage. They went bankrupt. So that was an issue. This wasn't a gift. There was a sense among the American-born Jews and even some of the German refugees who had came earlier that it was a gift, that they were getting, welfare that they had benefited from during the Depression, and there was some degree of resentment, which was unfair and untrue. They weren't getting outright gifts. The Jewish Agricultural Society later had to eat a lot of these loans. They weren't getting, and that created financial problems for the philanthropy. So it turned out more like a gift, but they were expected to pay the loans back.
Have you tracked where the other families went after the chicken farms closed?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you could, to generalize, some went to Atlantic City and opened motels or hotels, catering to tourists. Many moved to Cherry Hill, which is a suburb of Philadelphia. And then others, like my family, many moved to New York and Brooklyn. Others, I mentioned in the book, moved to places, Baltimore, Washington, LA, and they opened liquor stores or convenience stores, small businesses that you would think of. And a couple, unfortunately, they opened them in the late 60s, the era of urban unrest and riots, and 2 were killed during stick-ups. So a lot of them wound up as small business people. Some wound up as very successful real estate developers, one in Toronto, some in North Jersey. I write about in the book Miles Lerman, who came on the same boat as my grandparents and mom, the Marine Perch. He went on to be a very successful in the oil business in South Jersey and then real estate, and was one of the founders of the U.S. Holocaust Museum in D.C. and served as the president of the council that oversaw it. So a tremendous range in how much success people had after leaving the farm.
So it was really a jumping off point to, to become American.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I make the point, I don't think, even if this had been successful farming, that many of the survivors would have wanted their children to continue on the farms. They had the same ambition for their kids as any other American Jews of that era. They wanted them to go to college or become entrepreneurs and professionals. And in most instances, they did. They weren't disadvantaged by growing up on farms rather than growing up in Manhattan or other boroughs in New York or other cities. So the outcomes, the trajectories were similar for the survivor farmers' kids versus the ones who stayed in the big cities.
Thank you.
Seth, do you speak Yiddish fluently? And what about
I-
you?
I do not. I wish I did, and my mom makes the point. She tried. I know some words and trying to pass them along to my son, but I don't speak fluently like my mom and grandmother.
Thank you.
You haven't mentioned, the grandfather or your husband. They, your husband,
Yes.
I mean, is there any story there, or are they all, obviously they're deceased?
No, well, what's very interesting is that I married an American. And that's the way we distinguish American Jews versus survivors from Europe. So yes, I married an American. That answers your question. My father died in '86.
Family left South Jersey, where did they move to?
They left South Jersey, they moved to Brooklyn. And I started college and shortly after that met my husband. So we stayed with him.
Was he from the 5 towns?
My husband.
Wondering where you were going.
It's a long story. It was close to me. But it was like I went on this.
All right, if there's no other questions, I would like to say thank you so much, Seth.
Thank you.
And
Thank you all.
both of you, thank you very much, and we appreciate you taking the time out today, Seth. Thank you.
Thanks so much.